Now, for the next few minutes, we're going to look at some of the scandals that have broken since Hank Hanegraaff took over the ministry at CRI. There's three things we're going to take a consideration of. One is the early firings that took place from 1989 to about 1994. And many of the key people that Walter Martin had hired as staffers were simply dismissed or chased out of the organization right after Hanegraaff took over. Also, we're going to look at a scandal, a financial scandal that rocked CRI in 2002 when a young woman found that there were receipts being uncovered at CRI that showed that lots of high-priced items were being purchased for Hank Hanegraaff with CRI money. The third scandal we're going to look at briefly is the letter that was written in January of 2005 that tried to raise money based on the fact that Hank Hanegraaff claimed that the post office that operated the mail for him in Southern California had lost their mail for 90 days. We're going to look at that letter as well. But let's go back to the firings of original staff members under Walter Martin when Hank Hanegraaff originally took over. It should not be too difficult to understand why a person who managed to steal a ministry and was destined to use the organization for his own personal gratification and financial enrichment. It should also not be too difficult to believe how anyone in the first few years who questioned his abilities to lead CRI or who would show concern for how he was using staff and other CRI resources to create a personal wealth for himself was fired or forced to quit. The surprise is how quickly his own need for power and wealth so completely began to color his decisions. In even the first few weeks after he took control, his first act as president was to increase the salary he would receive to $60,000 per year within days after Walter Martin died. This was to be the first sign that CRI's primary mission would no longer be about ministry, but rather how Hank Hanegraaff would be able to enrich himself on the backs of staff and thousands of well-meaning contributors. It should be noted that from the founding of CRI in 1960 by Walter Martin, whose mission was to minister to the church and to reach into the vastly under-evangelized kingdom of the cults, had never been known to create an air of scandal or suspicion in nearly 30 years of ministry. Contrast that to Hank Hanegraaff, who was not present for 30 days before people began to see problems in how he was running the ministry. It was because Walter Martin was called to this area of ministry, and Hanegraaff was only becoming involved when he realized how much wealth could be extruded from the organization. The first major scandal began within months after he took over in June of 1989. Walter Martin had been very good at finding talented young researchers to help him carry out this very important ministry. This in a real way was key to helping provide up-to-date information on the many cults and false teachings that were a constant threat in the health of the church, to the health of the church. The training and education of the research staff was going to create a barrier between Hank Hanegraaff, at least in his mind, and ultimate control of CRI. He was painfully aware that each of his own research staff were required to have something that he lacked, a college degree. It is truly ironic that while Hank Hanegraaff publicly made quite a noise about how much he had a mandate to carry out the vision of Walter Martin, however, behind the closed doors of CRI, he began to find ways of firing or forcing to resign the very people that Martin had stated he had such pride in. This is a list of employees who left CRI from July 1989 to April 1984. Note the first employee left within a month after Hank Hanegraaff took over. Lisa Hawkins was a secretary. She left in July of '89. Dan Schlesinger, he was the research coordinator and accused of being divisive and was presented with several points of criticism by Hank Hanegraaff. He was fired in October of 1989. Jerry Kistler was a data entry department person, and he was fired by Hank Hanegraaff one day after he turned in a 1-month notice of resignation because of his complaints of Hank Hanegraaff. He was fired in March 1990. Craig Nelson, Director of Broadcast Media, he was fired when he questioned why Hanegraaff for-profit company Personal Witness Training in Memory Dynamics was not paying for advertising on the radio program. He was fired in May 1990. Craig Hawkins was a researcher and also hosted the Bible Answerman program. He confronted Hanegraaff on 5 points of lapses of integrity and attempted to resign. The board tried to intervene and tried to get them to reconcile, but Hanegraaff pushed the resignation. He left in June of 1990. Mark Hoover, with the Human Resources Accounts Payable Officer, he witnessed the misuse of CRI funds for Hanegraaff's memory dynamics business, an attempt to document irregular handlings of CRI checks to memory dynamics with little or no documentation. He left in June of 1990. Stan Tonnesen, who was the board member for 19 years under Walter Martin, though he was not a paid employee, he was planning to confront Hanegraaff at a board meeting in Atlanta, Georgia, with a list of letters from staff members who complained of unjust treatment and unethical behavior on the part of Hanegraaff. He exited in July of 1990. Robert Claypool was the security chief for CRI. He was released by the board of CRI after he began to investigate into the financial irregularities of Hank Hanegraaff. This was started after several employees began complaining. He left in July of 1990. Dan Kistler, David Anderson, and Denise Lee were correspondence research assistants, and Dan Kistler was interrogated by Hanegraaff concerning his brother Jerry's letter of resignation. All three later resigned in August 1990 to avoid an anticipated firing. Dennis Green, Director of Marketing, he had confronted Hanegraaff for failure to pay for an ad in the Christian Research Journal that was to promote personal witnessing training material. He also spoke to Hanegraaff about fulfilling the deferred compensation contract that he agreed upon for Dennis. He resigned in December 1990 because he believed the struggle with Hanegraaff would adversely affect his career. Janice Seaver, she was fired for talking too much in 1991. Dan McIngall, he was fired without cause in 1991. Robert Bowman, who was a researcher and special project editor, he was let go after he complained that Hanegraaff was putting his name on CRI perspectives that he had written. He was told he was being let go due to financial problems at the ministry. He was the only one let go during the crisis. He later found out that during the month that CRI had the highest month of contributions in CRI history to that date. That was the month before he was let go. He was fired in January of 1992. Perry Robinson, correspondence processing accounts receivable specialist, he was finally suspended and then fired in February of 1992. Ross Hooper, Michael Williams, and Wallace Helms were the entire correspondence processing department. They were fired for insubordination and gossip. They asked many questions about financial improprieties involving Hanegraaff's upcoming book. They also asked why free or low-cost material on the word faith was suddenly banned and people were told to wait for his forthcoming book, Christianity in Crisis. They also voiced concern for his lack of theological training. They were let go in October of 1992. Mike Stevens, who was CRI Director of Media, he had delivered several negative critiques of Hanegraaff's handling of the Bible Answerman program. After Hanegraaff took over full-time behind the microphone, only a few months after Craig Hawkins was fired in June of 1990. He was fired in October of 1992. Mary Cook, shipping department coordinator, she sent a complaint to the board over financial abuses and the size of Hanegraaff's salary. She was fired in July of 1993. Andy Kingsbury and Robert Velarde, correspondence research assistants. Kingsbury had asked questions about CRI's departure from ECFA. There was an attempt to fire him for too many jokes. They ultimately resigned to avoid further negative personal actions. Brad Sparks, who was scientific assistant to president, he criticized Hanegraaff's video performance in a failed attempt to buy the Full Gospel building in February 1993. He questioned Hanegraaff on December 2nd, 1993 about Kingsbury-Velarde forced departures. He was terminated on March 4th, 1994. Miriam Takahashi, she was a librarian. She was told of her termination on that same day at 9:45 in the morning. Joan Moore, executive assistant researcher, she was fired because she leaked information about the impending mass firings on March 4th, 1994. Rich Bonis, correspondence research assistant, fired at 2 p.m. on March 4th, 1994. Ed Hammond, correspondence research assistant, he was told of his firings at 2 p.m. on March 4th, 1994. Donnie Bergeron, customer service representative, he had resigned effective March 8th, 1994, but he was moved up to March 4th, 1994 by the administration. Jim Sawyer, customer service representative, he was yelled at by supervisor Terrell Bryan for discussing the day's mass firings. He quit in protest the same day. B.G. Orpeza and Stephen Ross, they were demoted from research assistant positions in research and executive departments to positions in correspondence processing in March of 1994. Ellen Grisby, she was demoted from position as Hank Hanegraaff's executive secretary to developmental department representative in March of 1994. Robert Lyle, the vice president for research, he was fired 3 days after the mass firings of March 4th, 1994. Naomi Merchant, she was executive assistant to the president, but due to demotion of Grisby, she was overwhelmed by the extra work. She quit in April of 1994. These type of magnitude of firings and demotions were unprecedented under Walter Martin. However, even in the first few weeks and months, as we have just seen with the compiled list of former employers after Hank Hanegraaff took over, many employees began to see financial abuse and an incredible heavy-handed approach in the misuse of power. Both are indicative of a person who was not called to be a Christian ministry, but saw CRI and its crisis as a fantastic opportunity to create his own personal fiefdom. There seems to be another motive for getting rid of most of the research staff. At the time Hank Hanegraaff became president, researchers were required to have a minimum of 4 years degree. Since Hanegraaff had never finished his degree at Calvin College, he may have felt threatened by their combined knowledge of world religions, cults, and apologetics. Knowing he had nowhere near the grasp of information that the president of the largest cult apologetics ministry would need to be considered competent. Since he took the reins of power in such an unethical manner, it appears he may have begun to entertain the notion that some of them would begin to identify his vast reservoir of ignorance and plan their own coup. His statement to Craig Nelson in early February 1990 concerning Craig Hawkins, quote, "Craig Hawkins is a wolf in sheep's clothing. He's power hungry," bears this out. This form of paranoia is indicative of a man who has a guilty conscience. He assumes others will do to him what he knows he has already done. Hank Hanegraaff will probably claim that with any change of leadership, you will see a change in personnel. While this is true, an organization like CRI, whose very reason for being is to inform others concerning the cults and how to respond in love to this large mission field, it will be ineffective if you strip of its most experienced and gifted researchers. It would be like the new president of a soft drink company on his first day firing everyone who worked in the plant that bottled the beverage. He would severely impair his companies from providing the product for which it exists. A good president would find creative ways to work with the talent and keep them happy, so they would continue to work for which the organization is known. Rather, what CRI was saddled with was a petulant, immature president who was still controlled by his most irrational hunger for wealth and self-aggrandizement. During the first few months and after the wave of firings began, many employees wrote heartfelt letters to the CRI board asking for help and intervention. The following are excerpts from 3 of the letters that were written expressing their deep concern for what was happening at CRI. The first letter is from Dan Schlesinger, former research coordinator. Now, these are excerpts of his letter. As I stated above, I felt the position of CRI Research Department Coordinator. I held the position of Research Department Coordinator previous to my departing CRI. Given the fact that I held a responsible position at CRI and not wanting to perpetuate rumor or misinformation regarding Hank's position or agenda, I refrained from addressing questions or giving my own personal opinions to those coming to me with concerns. However, questions kept coming from individuals pulling me aside or coming to my office regarding Hank's qualifications, etc. After several weeks of this, I began to see there was much greater concern on all levels of ministry, never mind my own personal questions and opinions, than I first suspected. The executive committee, Elliot Miller, Rich Pohl, and Paul Carden, advised me to go directly to Hank and share with him all that had happened the previous couple of weeks. I immediately went to Hank. Jane Huckabee was there also, and began to share the aforementioned concerns. Hank got very upset, raising his voice at me, asking what right I had to question his credentials. He then questioned my background in education, though at the time I had a master's degree, and insisted he could debate with the best of there was on the subject of creation, evolution, and other issues, and that he had memorized all of Walter Martin's tapes and read over 16 books on the New Age movement. When questioning his lack of formal education, Hank responded by saying I was arrogant and prideful to even bring up the subject. And then Hank then insisted that I name the individuals who raised questions and other concerns. I felt uncomfortable in doing so and asked that they remain unknown until a later date. Hank insisted again, and I name names, and so I gave him an example regarding one individual, sharing briefly his concern. I really realize now I probably should not have mentioned this person, but as was the case in most instances, Hank had a rather forceful and manipulative way of getting what he wanted. After an hour or so, Hank asked me to leave and said that he would call me back to his office later that morning. Once again, about mid-afternoon of the same day, I was called back into Hank's office. This time he was to be told that several individuals recommended dismissing me because of my attitude problems. Hank told me that he was told that I had a long history of divisiveness and failed to submit to those whom I was accountable to. In spite of all these allegations, Hank stated he was willing to give me another chance to work it out, and therefore allowed me to continue on with CRI. After a couple of hours or so, Hank was interrupted by a phone call regarding his seminar tapes. He got up and left to take care of his business and finally came back to the meeting. He immediately stated that it would be to the best interest of CRI and for me to part company and go on my way. I broke down and cried. He said he would do anything he could to make my departure smooth and painless as possible, and that he would be more than happy to write me a letter of recommendation. I was told I could pick up my books and other belongings later. Not at that time. I left CRI that day devastated. From the first time I came, I was made aware of Hank Hanegraaff's possible involvement with CRI. I had personal reservations whether it would be to the best interest of CRI to bring him on, except in an executive administrative capacity. It had been communicated to the research staff that he would function in this role. However, after Hank shared his own objectives in a company meeting, it became quite clear that he was going to integrate his own ministry, PWT, with CRI's ministry. At first, it seemed there might be some merit to what he was saying. However, in reality, what he was really saying was CRI would become his ministry. Indeed, since Dr. Martin's untimely death, that's exactly what has happened, what it has become. Hank has no formal education. One would think that a person holding the position of president of an apologetic and counter-cult ministry would possess at least a BA or MA degree in a field of relevant to CRI's area of ministry. Though many in the research department hold BA or MA degrees, the credibility, both academic and spiritual, of CRI suffers when its own president and leader lacks any formal education. This leads me to my second point. Hank's depth of knowledge, to include his critical thinking abilities on the cults, the occult, apologetics, and theology, is lacking. This is evidenced by statements he has made to the research staff as well as on the radio program on BAM. Hank's burden calling to reach cultists for Christ. As I understand Hank's background, he has primarily developed a ministry which teaches people how to memorize basic information related to the Bible. To my knowledge, he has never been interested in counter-cult studies, at least on the level that Dr. Martin and CRI staff have been. What his personal experience what has his personal experience been with reaching out to cults and the occult before coming to CRI? Moreover, what has his burden been, particularly as it relates to the ministry of CRI? Those of us on the research staff have years of counter-cult apologetics ministry before coming to CRI based on a special burden and calling to reach those lost in the cults for Jesus Christ. Hank consistently demonstrates conduct unbecoming Christian leadership. When confronted by concerns, questions, or comments regarding his credentials or decision-making, Hank exhibits anger, verbal outbursts, endless self-defense, manipulation of others' words, and self-aggrandizement. These are not marks or characteristics of a sensitive, humble Christian leader. Hank's ego-building and self-serving motives are spiritually unhealthy to a ministry which prides itself on doctrinal and spiritual discernment. Need I say more on this? Hank Hanegraaff is not an apologist, theologian, nor an expert on the cults or the occult. Hank Hanegraaff, in my opinion, is a lay evangelist pretending to be what he is not. He should be exercising those gifts God has bestowed on him in his respective ministry, field of ministry. Hank Hanegraaff needs to be removed from the ministry of CRI. He should not be allowed to pontificate on matters of faith or doctrine, as he is clearly unqualified to do so. Either should he be allowed to perpetuate the wrongdoing he has brought on many others since my departure. The next letter are excerpt from Rich Abanis, who worked in the shipping department. I have worked at CRI in the shipping department since September of 1989. During this last time of 9 months, I have never been reprimanded in any way by the administration, so I am not seeking revenge by saying that Hank Hanegraaff is unfit spiritually and emotionally to be president of CRI. I base this accusation primarily not solely on the evidence which suggests that Hank Hanegraaff may be consumed with the love of money. Hank has been and is currently using CRI for his own personal gain. He does this by using CRI as a means of advertising and distribution of personal witness training, memory dynamics materials. I have personally been involved with Hank's PWT seminars as worship leader, but must now refrain from any further involvement. Hank has used CRI to purchase a large quantity of PWT materials, irregardless of the small amount of orders for them that we receive. This is the most unethical action I have personally seen. My knowledge of it began with the writing of a purchase order, number 3696. On PO 3696, you will see 50 manuals and 50 tapes, PWT /001. Ordered at the bottom, you will see 50 manuals, 50 tapes, PWT /001 to be ordered at a later date. This second order is not based on need as a result of sales. The second order will be made only because of pressure exerted by Hank, Kathy, and Jane Huckabee on our shipping department head, Mary Cook, whose job is to decide what and how much we order. I am foreman of shipping and know our stock needs. We do not need more PWT materials. We can't even sell what we've stocked. We've received very few orders for PWT materials. Jane demanded we order a 100 PWT /001, bringing the total PO bill to approximately $6,000, and promised Kathy H. full payment before we ever received stock. Jane and Hank because of their position at CRI, can tell CRI what to buy from PWT/MD. This may not be illegal, but perhaps it's unethical, especially in a Christian ministry where funds are so precious. I told Hank many employees were becoming despondent. I said, Hank, you can't run a ministry like a business. To which he said, you're wrong, and accused me of over-spiritualizing the situation. Finally, the most painful occurrence at CRI has been the mass exodus of godly employees who truly love CRI. Many left frustrated, spiritually drained, and bitter. And now there is an overall feeling of fear, distrust, and darkness each day at the ministry. I love Hank and Jane and Scott as part of my family in Christ, but I can no longer stand by and watch power be used in such an unrighteous and insensitive way. The broken hearts of employees, my own personal experiences, letters from supporters, and the Holy Spirit in prayer bring me to this conclusion that Hank Hanegraaff should be removed as president of CRI. The reality of the situation at CRI is painfully obvious to anyone who has eyes to see. This next letter is an excerpt from Michael Stevens. He was the former director of broadcast media. This is what he says. Within a few short months after Craig Hawkins departed the ministry, Hank decided to go on and host the live broadcast daily instead of just on Wednesdays. This was shortly after he told me personally that when he would listen to the Bible Answer Man, hosted by Paul Card and Rob Bowman, Ken Samples et al., he realized that he can answer 9 out of 10 questions, of every 10 questions, that he would hear on the show. This comment made me very nervous, as I know what it is like dealing with everything from alleged contradictions to logic, to different theological viewpoints, to cultists knowing how to manipulate Scripture. But sure enough, Hank was so confident that everything he could easily be handled by giving a bottom-line response or a pat answer of some sort. Never did a BAM broadcast go by without Hank rewording a caller's questions. To enable himself to answer the reworded question, Hank would usually ask, "Does that help?" or something along those lines, and the response by the caller was often something like, "Well, actually," in which Hank would say, "Well, stay on the line and we'll send you out some information," and not ever really answer the question, probably due to ignorance. I still listen to the broadcast almost on a daily basis since KWVE 107.9 FM, where I now work, carries it. Sure enough, this pattern has not changed at all. In fact, it has worsened, in my opinion. There was also 2 other unfortunate things that happened on the Bible Answering program quite regularly. The first is this. Hank would walk into the studio, briefly scan the pre-screened caller sheets, and then scramble to work to find a quick fix answer. Sometimes he would ask Ron Rhodes or Bob Lyle what this work meant, or what that cult believes, what this word meant, or what the cult believes. Some of the questions to which Hank had no answer were frighteningly simple. I must say that he didn't always do this. The sad fact is that when he didn't, the answer would often be wrong. The other occurrence, which was particularly disturbing, was when Bob Lyle or Erwin De Castro or someone was assigned to watch 2 pre-screened caller sheets and provide written responses for Hank to read on the air. Sometimes it was a CRI perspective which someone else wrote. Sometimes it was a CRI drawer item or statement. Sometimes it was something scribbled by hand. He was able to develop a technique which he would purposely stumble every few words to give the illusion that the answer was at the top of his head. He would often say, "If my memory serves me correctly," when citing a scripture reference or a date or a name or something, when he was actually reading off the paper. This for the purpose of convincing the audience that his answers were truly from memory. This happened daily. I even have plenty of witnesses to this fact who still work there. This is not the Bible answer man in the true sense of the word. The true Bible answer man should be a man who knows the answers from the Bible. But none was more embarrassing than when a lay Mormon, Richard Hopkins, turned Hank into a theological pretzel while standing in the hallway of CRI after debating Robert Morey. Here was Hank Hanegraaff, president of the largest evangelical counter-cult ministry on earth, being led around on a doctrinal leash by some self-proclaimed LDS apologist who doesn't even do this sort of thing full time. One example, while speaking of Colossians 1:15 and 16, a favorite among those who deny the deity of Christ, Hank boasted with much arrogance to Mr. Hopkins that he had memorized the verse. Richard's very polite response was, "Yes, I not only memorized the verse, but I studied in the Greek," and then went on to prove his point. Once again, Hank was left speechless and at a loss as what to say, but sure enough, Hank, well, you know. Another example of Hank's insecurity and immaturity was a time when he had Bob Eloff of the Religious Information Service in Long Beach, California, as a guest on the Bible Answer Man program. Bob's forte is Iglesia Ni Cristo, a growing Aryan cult who's originated in the Philippines. The focus on the broadcast was on this religious group, but somehow Hank steered some of the callers' questions back to talking about the word faith movement, his favorite subject. I handed him a note during the program which suggests that he stick to the topic at hand and to keep his comments about word of faith to a minimum. Little did I know this was a big mistake. After that day's broadcast, I noticed Hank stomp up to his office with a body language that resembled a spoiled little child who didn't get what he wanted. Concerned, I followed him up to his office and inquired about the apparent problem. Hank's response, "Look, if you don't want me on the broadcast, just tell me. You and Craig Hawkins and everybody else are all alike. Hank, you don't know nothing about no cults. Hank, you don't know theology. Hey, Mike, do what you want. Why don't you just host the show yourself?" He said all this without ever looking me in the eye. I could not believe my eyes and ears. Another such instance which surprised me was when Hank made a very unfavorable remark regarding the abilities of others on staff. When speaking on the topic of seminars, he stated with much confidence that he was the only person in the organization who could give a seminar. Having studied under the Bodines and been quite impressed with their teaching abilities, I was puzzled by this remark. I said, "Well, what about Jerry and Marion?" Hank's response with a smirk, "Let me say that again. I am the only one on staff who can give a decent seminar." Now, at the end of these letters, and we literally have like a dozen or more of them, we saw many of these letters had similar type phrases in them. Words like paranoia, lover of money, arrogant, underqualified, uneducated, not called to this type of ministry, angry outbursts, manipulative. These were words repeated over and over in these letters. It just comes up regularly in all these letters from these former staff members who were concerned about Hanegraaff as the president of CRI. Now, these are obviously not words that you want identified with a Christian leader who is supposed to be humble and loving and giving as a Christian leader, but these are the words of a person who really has no place in Christian ministry. And besides the fact that this information should show you rather emphatically that Hank Hanegraaff had no place becoming the president of CRI. He was not handpicked by Walter Martin in any sense of the term. But not only that, but since his becoming president in 1989, we have seen several scandals erupt at CRI. This one, of course, the massive firings, problems with original staff that Martin had hired. This was a problem. Then the second scandal I want to highlight what took place in the year 2002 when a young woman who worked in the correspondence area had stumbled over some receipts that indicated that Hank Hanegraaff was being given gifts, financial monies, towards personal purchases that had nothing to do with CRI. She began to stay late at night and actually photocopy these receipts that she kept coming in contact with, and then she kept a list of them at her house. But she came across receipts in excess of tens of thousands of dollars. One was for flooring in excess of $9,000 for the Hank Hanegraaff house. There were purchases of personal computers for his children. There was a mention of a country club membership for Hank Hanegraaff was paid for CRI with CRI funding. There's also the purchase of a $60,000 plus Lexus sports car that was given to Hank Hanegraaff as a luxury vehicle to be driven by him using CRI funds. Now, it wasn't until the LA Times and the Christianity Today newspaper or magazine broke these stories on a national level that Hanegraaff paid the money back, and he referred to these as naive accounting errors, that they were just simply errors that were really not meant to have been performed, but they were just accidents. And I've always been interested in figuring out, how do you accidentally go out and buy a $60,000 sports car for the head of your ministry? So that was a major scandal in 2002 that really showed that the financial ends of the ministry was really what Hanegraaff was trying to get out of CRI. and that he really was not intending to be the minister of CRI the way Walter Martin had intended to be the minister of CRI. Now, the final scandal that I just want to reference was very interesting was in 2005 when a letter was reported on his website. A fundraising letter was reported on the CRI website written by Hank Hanegraaff about a supposed loss of mail that CRI had that had happened to CRI because the post office had supposedly lost mail for up to 90 days, and they needed to have an infusion of cash immediately because of this oversight by the post office in Rancho Santa Margarita. Here's an actual copy of the letter that was sent out to one of his supporters, and this is what the letter actually said from Hank Hanegraaff. I never imagined having to send an urgent memo like this to you. A bizarre error by the U.S. Post Office has cost the Christian Research Institute and Bible Answer Man broadcast an unknown amount of income at a time when we could least afford it. We don't know how much we lost, but we know it was substantial, perhaps in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Here's what happened. Over the last 3 months, a time when our ministry receives 17% of its yearly income from supporters, newly hired U.S. Post Office employees in Rancho Santa Margarita accidentally routed CRI envelopes with contributions and requests for materials to the wrong post office box. To make matters worse, the business to which the envelopes were sent threw many of the envelopes into the trash. Only by God's grace did we discover this error before more damage was done. Praise God for his intervention. Our local U.S. Post Office has accepted full responsibility for this error and has fixed the problem. You can be assured that all mail is now being handled correctly. We bear them no ill will and believe this was an honest mistake by novice postal employees, but much has been lost. Here's what I'm asking you to do. And so then they go on and talk about how to replace the money. Now, I looked into this situation of this lost letter. I thought this was very odd when I first saw it on their website. And a friend of mine, Bill Alnor, also looked into it. And we actually both contacted the post office there in Rancho Santa Margarita independently of each other. And I was told by the acting post office manager that they had never lost that quantity of mail that CRI had claimed. In fact, there was 30 pieces of mail that were delivered to a company called On Target Marketing in Southern California for 1 day that belonged to CRI, but that mail was promptly returned to CRI by On Target Marketing, and that was the extent of the loss. There was no 90-day mail lost. In fact, when I talked to the acting manager of the Rancho Santa Margarita post office, he said that we had never officially apologized to CRI because this mail had not been lost for 3 months. It had only been lost for about 1 day. It was only 30 pieces. So there was no official apology. He didn't know what I was talking about, in fact. And there was a U.S. postal investigation that was instigated because of this supposed lost mail situation. And the U.S. Post Office investigatory branch, after looking into the process, found that there was never any lost mail that was caused by this problem at the post office, and the CRI was never in any danger of losing 3 months' worth of contributions. But again, this is just another financial problem that keeps coming up at CRI because Hank Hanegraaff really does not deserve to be the president. He was never meant to be the president, and his need to squeeze money out of people is becoming an apparent problem, which has really been going on over the last 9 or 10 years. But again, since his taking over in 1989, it's been shown, clearly here that he has changed the vision of CRI. A lot of the things that were talked about, Walter Martin being the president, of the paper of the CRI journal. That's been taken out. The fact that you can barely even find any mention of him on his own website any longer, Walter Martin's website. The idea that even though he talked in glowing terms at his funeral, he no longer even hardly mentions Walter Martin as the president of CRI. So again, we just see that Hank Hanegraaff really never was intended to be the president of CRI. These scandals kind of show that the true heart of the man. He really does not belong at this helm of this ministry. And I would ask two things of people who listen to this broadcast. If you are currently supporting CRI financially, I would ask that you stop doing so until the administration of that organization changes to a more godly administration. Because the more money that's poured into CRI, the longer it's going to take for the administrative change to take place, if at all. Now, if you want to give to another Christian counter-cult ministry, there are many good ministries out there that are in desperate need of your money. Secondly, I would also state that if you are currently writing for CRI Journal or helping them with some of their publications as a paid individual for this, that you discontinue writing for them, because you're just, again, further giving them credibility in this area. And since they don't have their own people to write any longer, except for Elliot Miller and Hank Hanegraaff, it really would help if they have less writers to choose from, because it'll, again, further erode their ability to do their job under the Hank Hanegraaff administration. And these two things need to be implemented immediately to help this ministry overcome, because we don't want to see the Christian Research Institute cease to exist as an organization. What we need to see is the corrupted administration of Hank Hanegraaff taken out, and a godly administration put in its place, so that CRI can again go back to being what Walter Martin, the founder, had intended, a ministry that not only helps build the church's ability to combat false doctrines and false teachings, but be able to more effectively share the good news of the gospel with those individuals who are lost to the kingdom of the cults and the occult. And this is what we hopefully, this presentation will aid you in doing, giving you a better sense of how to help CRI become the ministry that it was always intended to be. Thank you.